Rabbi, we're into DAF Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph. Yesterday, we talked about not only a lulav hagazel, but we also talked about a SUKKAH hagazel, a stolen sukkah. And we established that the only time that there's a machlokus about the status of a stolen sukkah is only when the real estate is stolen. In other words, the land, you appropriate the land illicitly, and you sit in it. That's where Rabbi Eliezer says you're not Yotzei, and the Chachamim say you are Yotzei. However, says the Gemara, let's say the land is yours, but you steal someone else's schach. You steal someone's wood, and you place it on top of your sukkah as schach. So there the Gemara had said that everyone agrees that you can be Yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah that way. And the reason is because you're totally kona it immediately as soon as you put it on top of your sukkah, and that sort of obviates the issue of a mitzvah haba ba'avera. And the reason is this concept of takanas hashavim, which we mentioned yesterday, is that the rabbis went easy on a gazlan who's stolen construction materials and already built them into a structure. In order to enable him to do tshuva, we only require him to make financial compensation and not return the original object. Normally, when you steal something, you have to return that which you stole. You've got to give back the object. But if you steal a really expensive wooden beam and you build it into your multi-million-dollar home, so then we don't require you to demolish the house in order to return the beam. You just have to pay the guy the value. So because of this leniency, it completely removes the stigma of stolen off of this object that you've used for schach, and therefore the schach is kosher, the sukkah is kosher, but you have a financial debt to the person from whom you've stolen. That's the bottom line. Now the Gemara presents us with a story to illustrate this idea. Hahi savta da'asoy lekami de Rav Nachman. There was an elderly woman who once comes before Rav Nachman, and in order to understand the story, remember Rav Nachman was the rabbi of the Reish Galusa's court. In other words, he was sort of like the official Rav Harashi of Bavel. And Amrle Reish Galusa v'kulu rabbanan devei Reish Galusa v'sukkah gezula habu yasvi. And she said to him, hey, Rabbi, the Reish Galusa, the exilarch, and all of the rabbis of his court are sitting in a stolen sukkah because they stole schach from my property, and they took this wood and they put it on the sukkah of the Reish Galusa, and it's stolen. I want my wood back. So tzavcha v'lo ashkach b'Rav Nachman. So she started kvetching and yelling and screaming and complaining, and Rav Nachman just blows her off. He ignores her. Amrale itza dahavale la'avuha tlas mea utmane srei avdei tzvacha kamaychu v'lo ashkachisu ba. She said, what are you, Rabbi? How can you just ignore me? After all, I'm an important person. My father had 318 servants, and you're just going to blow me off? She was referring to Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu, according to the Medrash, had 318 servants. That's the gematria of Eliezer, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that's 318, right? If I'm not mistaken.
318 men will fight against.
That's right. So that's why it's Eliezer corresponds to 318 men. Anyway, so the point is that she says to him, who are you to blow me off? Look at how important I am. I get this all the time in my office. Right? People tell me how important they are, and that's why I have to give them the time of day. So Amr Lahura, and I'm happy to do so, of course. Amr Lahura Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman responds to her, and he says, Pe'isa hida ve'ein la ela demei eitzim bilvad. So Rav Nachman says, this woman's a loudmouth. That's literally what it means. She's a noisemaker. And she's just making a lot of noise, and all she's entitled to is financial compensation. Sorry, lady, you can't get your wood back. The sukkah's kosher. They're going to continue sitting in the sukkah, and you know what? They owe you some money. Fine, you'll get paid your money.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Even though it's the same material, like the other
even
case
though it's
you gave,
exactly the same.
It's built into the house. It's
correct.
You
correct.
Don't see it, but here so they can just take it back.
You're right. The Chachamim made this takana, even though the schach is easily removed from the sukkah, but in order you have to dismantle it.
Part of the structure.
And especially, you'll see, during the 7 days of Sukkot, this is my sukkah, this is my home.
It's your roof.
It's my roof, right?
This is sort of a shana, it's an odd story. I mean, you're not talking about any old story. The Reish Galusa and the rabbis are sitting in a stolen...
Right. Apparently what happened was, someone from the Reish Galusa's court. The Reish Galusa is a little bit of a gray area as far as their ethics. There are a number of stories in the Gemara that the Reish Galusa wasn't always on the up and up. It's, like the chief rabbinate of Israel. Doesn't mean that
Rabbi.
Oh, sorry. Whoops. Okay, let's go on. Amar Ravina. Amar Ravina. Hai kishura de metalalta de gazula. Abdi Let's scratch that one. We'll edit that out.
They're not watching English stuff, you know what
I didn't mean to get you started.
What goes on the Daf Yomi stays in Daf Yomi.
Trust me, that's mild to compared to what I really want to say. Amar Ravina. Amar Ravina. Hai kishura de metalalta de gazula. Avdi le rabbanan takanta mishum takanas meresh. So Ravina says it's not just true with SUKKAH. If a person were to steal an actual construction beam and insert it on top of his sukkah or in his sukkah for some reason, he still would have the same provision that he doesn't have to dismantle the sukkah in order to return the beam. It's not just true about SUKKAH, but it's true about an expensive construction beam as well. So the Gemara says, Pshita, Maishna me eitzim. Why would I think that's any different from stealing wood and putting it in your sukkah? So the Gemara says, Mahu the tema eitzim shchichi aval hailo shchicha emalo kamash malan. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because you might think that maybe the Rabbanan, when it comes to sukkah, like Shlomi was arguing, it's a temporary structure anyway. You can easily remove the wood, and also wood is very commonly found. So if I steal your wood from your woodshed, so fine, you'll get some other wood. What's the big deal? But a construction beam, it's not so easy to come by. It's expensive. It's not so easy for a person who loses a construction beam to have to go and find another one. I mean, these things they grow on trees, that's right. But they're not so easy because they are expensive and it is much harder to manufacture. So therefore, you might have thought that the Chachamim are not as lenient with a sukkah as they are with a regular construction project, and that's the Chiddush of Ravina. Hani mili begav shiva v'alabasar shiva hadar be'eni. And furthermore, the Gemara says, when we say that you only have to pay the guy cash, and you don't have to give him back the original SUKKAH, the original construction beam, that's only true during Sukkot. We don't require you to dismantle the sukkah. But once Sukkot is over, and you've got the beam and you've got the wood, and you can easily just give it to the person, so then you're obligated to pay it back. But if you've actually cemented it into the structure, so then it becomes like a regular construction, a home construction project, and there too you're not obligated to dismantle it and dislodge it from its cemented area. Just pay the guy what the cost of the beam or the wood is. Tana. Yavesh puzzle. So let's go back to our discussion of the lulav. The lulav that's dried out, the Mishnah had said that lulav is puzzle, right? So, but Rabbi Yehuda argues, and he says that it's still kosher even if it's a dried out lulav. So Amar Rava machlokas belulav derabanan savri makshim lulav laesrog maesrog boy hadar af lulav boy hadar. Rabbi Yehuda savri lo makshim lulav laesrog. So the machlokas says Rava, and remember this is Rava's opinion. Rava says that the only time that there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is only about a lulav, and the issue is like this. The Torah says that the esrog has to be pre-eitz hadar. It has to be the fruit of the beautiful tree, which implies that the esrog has to be an attractive piece of produce. And the question is, does the lulav have that same connection to hadar as esrog does? So the Chachamim say that it's just like an esrog has to be hadar, it has to be attractive, so too the lulav has to be attractive, and if it's not, it's pasul. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, only the esrog has to be attractive, but the lulav does not. And therefore, aval be'esrog divrei kol hadar ba'inan. But everyone agrees that the esrog has to be attractive because the Torah calls it hadar, right? So therefore, this is the way Rava learns the machlokes. There's only a machlokes by lulav, but everyone agrees that an esrog has to be attractive, it cannot be dried out. So frek the Gemara, uvelulav lo boy Rabbi Yehuda hadar. So one second, let's question the whole premise. You mean to tell me that Rabbi Yehuda does not require a lulav to be hadar, to be attractive? V'hatnan Rabbi Yehuda omer yogedenu milamala. We also learned in our Mishnah that if you have a lulav that fans out, remember we said, Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher provided that you clamp it up. You got to tie it up at the top. So the Gemara says, "My taima, lav mishum deboy hadar." Isn't it because he requires it to be attractive? So the Gemara says, "Lo kidekatani taima Rabbi Huda omer mishum Rabbi Tarfon kapos temorim kafus vim hayaparud yechaftenu." So he learns from the pasuk. The Torah calls the lulav fronds kapos temorim. The word kapos is a frond, but it refers to a special type of frond that is closed, because the word kapos, means bound. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda learns that the pasuk means that if it's not bound, because the leaves flare out, you have an obligation to bind them. That's the way he learns the pasuk. It's got nothing to do with attractiveness of the frond. So now the Gemara says v'lo boi hadar, but still I'll show you that he needs it to be hadar, because v'hatnan ein ogdenes halulav ela bimino diver Rabbi Yehuda. My time alav mishum de boi hadar. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you have to tie the arba minim together. And furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda says that when you tie the arba minim together, you have to use the species of the lulav in order to tie them together. That's why we use those, what do they call them in Yiddish?
Ringlich.
The ringlich?
Yeah.
No, what's the holder called?
Oh, the holder.
What do they call that holder? Come on, Shlomo.
I should know. My kids.
Yeah. All right. Whatever they call that thing, right? That's made out of lulav leaves. You have to use. It's got to be the same species. Mendel, what is it called? It's got to be the same. All right. It's got to be. You don't use it?
No, the Lubavitch don't use it. They hold it
They
together.
tie it.
Okay. But it's got to be the same species as the lulav itself. So isn't that because it needs to be hadar, so it needs to look like it's part of the whole structure so that it looks attractive? So no, that's not the reason. As we know, that's not the reason, because Rav himself had taught us that it could be from any part of the palm tree. It could even be from the soft bark or from the root of the palm tree, which clearly does not look the same as a lulav. So it's not because you want it to blend in and look nice, but rather it's because of a different reason, that it's got to be the same species as the lulav itself. And ve'ela my time at the Rebbe Yehuda hasam de kasavra lulav tzarach eged v'maisi mina achrina havlu chamisha minim. The answer is a technical reason that's got nothing to do with its appearance, but rather it has to do with the fact that Rabbi Yehuda requires that the three of the four species have to be halachically bound together. Now, if you bind it with a material that is foreign, that is not one of the three species, so then it looks like you're binding it with a fifth species other than the arba minim. And so therefore, that's what the chisaron is, that it looks like it's baltosif. It looks like you're adding on to the mitzvah by using an additional item that's not one of the materials of the arba minim.
Are they talking about just the lulav, when they're talking about drying out in the hadar, are they talking about just the lulav itself, or the rava and the...
Well, we don't know about the arav and the hadas yet. So far, we're only talking about the lulav. But that's an important discussion. We're going to see later on what the criteria are for the hadas and the arava. Okay. So the Gemara has clarified that you see that Rabbi Yehuda does not require the lulav to be hadar, and that's why he says that even if it's dry, it's kosher. But, said Rava, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the esrog has to be hadar. So the Gemara is going to question that. Uve esrog mi boy Rabbi Yehuda hadar. Since when? V'hatanya. Look at the brisa. Arbas minim shebelulav kishem she'in pochesin mehen kachein mosifan aleihem. When you have the arba minim, just like you can't subtract and have three species, so too you can't add and have five species. Lo matzah esrog lo yovi lo farish v'lo rimon v'lo davar acher. And furthermore, if you can't find an esrog for whatever reason, you should not substitute it with a quince, which is like an old world apple, right? Or a pomegranate, even though they're approximately the same size, but you use nothing. Kamushin kesherin yaveshin pesulin. If it's shriveled somewhat, it's still kosher, but if it's totally dry, then it's puzzle. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer af yaveshin. But Rabbi Yehuda says even a dry esrog is kosher. It seems that's what he's saying. So v'Omer Rabbi Yehuda Maisa Livnei krachin shayu morishan es lulavehem livnei b'neihem. And he says, to wit, I know of a certain city, because they were city slickers and they didn't have orchards to grow these materials, so they used to pass on as an inheritance their lulavim to their children. So it says lulavehem. It says they used to pass on their lulavs to their children, but the assumption is it's all arba minim, right? So amrulo misham raya in shasad chak raya. So the rabbi said back to him, you can't prove a story, an illustration from a case where they didn't have the opportunity to use fresh produce. There they didn't have any options. So what do you want from us? Maybe they weren't Yotzei the mitzvah, but they wanted just to commemorate the mitzvah. So anyway, but that's the end of the brisa. Kitani mihas, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af yaveshin kesherim. But you see from that brisa that Rabbi Yehuda says if it's dry, it's kosher. And so my lava esrog. It's the assumption is since he doesn't distinguish, it seems like he's talking about the esrog as well. And you see from here that a dry esrog is kosher. It's a challenge to Rava. So the Gemara says, lo, a lulav. No, he was only talking about a dried out lulav. But really, he still requires that the esrog be fresh. So let's go back. Omar Mar, Kishem she'ein poches in mehen kachein mosifan aleim. Just like you're not allowed to subtract from the arba minim, so too you're not allowed to add to the arba minim. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? We know there's a halach of baltosif. So what's the chiddush here? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what the chiddush is. Mahu detei mahol v'amar Rabbi Yehuda lulav tzarch eged v'maisim min achrina hayluchudei koi kamash malon. So the way Rashi and Tosfos seemingly explain it is like this. Rabbi Yehuda requires that the arba minim be bound together. At least 3 out of the 4 be bound together. So therefore comes along the brisa to tell me, even though Rabbi Yehuda requires that the minim be bound together, therefore you might think, so what's the harm if I take another species, and let's say I take a rose, and I hold it, after I've bound my lulav and my hadas and my arava together, I hold a rose next to it together with my esrog. So you might say, well, what's the big deal? It's not bound together with the lulav, so therefore there's no problem. So the brisa says, no, even though Rabbi Yehuda requires it to be bound, and this is not bound, it's still a problem if you're representing this as part of the mitzvah. That's the chiddush of the brisa. Amar Mar. Lo matzah esrog lo yavi lo rimon velo farish velo davar acher. So the brisa also said that if you can't find an esrog, then you can't substitute it with a quince or with a pomegranate or any other fruit, like a lemon. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? No, because Mahu detema laisi ki hechi shelo tishachach toras esrog kamash malan zimna denafik chor v'minei da'asti lemisrach. You might have thought, you know what? All right, the guy can't find an esrog this year. Let him substitute it with something that's approximately the same size, so that at least he'll remember for next year how the mitzvah is normally supposed to be done. But the chiddush of the brisa is you shouldn't do that, because actually you're going to end up to the detriment of the mitzvah in the future. Because people will see you holding a pomegranate or an apple next to your lulav, and they'll think, oh, that's just as good. And people will think that that's part of the mitzvah as well. And therefore, we don't allow any substitutes. Tashma. So now let's continue. Esrog hayashan pasul v'Reb Yehuda machshir. Look at the brisa. The brisa says explicitly that an old esrog is pasul, but Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So you who have been trying to tell me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, he agrees that you need to have a fresh esrog, and if it's dry, it's pasul, this brisa refutes that. To yufta de Rava? To yufta. Yes, you're right. This brisa refutes Rava. We see very clearly that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require a fresh esrog. Even a dry esrog, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is kosher. Now the question is going to be, what about the word hadar? Hold on to your hats, we'll get to it. V'lo boy hadar, so the Gemara says, you're telling me he doesn't require it to be hadar? V'ha'anan tanan, hayarok kikarsi Rabbi Meir machshav Rabbi Yehuda post. We have another Mishnah we'll learn later on that says that if the esrog is completely green, like a leek, so then Rabbi Meir says it's possible, but Rabbi Meir says it's kosher, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's possible. Lav mishum de boy hadar, isn't it because Rabbi Yehuda requires the esrog to be attractive? Lo. Mishum de lo gomar peira. No, because it hasn't ripened. If it's totally green, it hasn't ripened, and Rabbi Yehuda requires a ripe fruit, because if it's unripened, it's not called the fruit yet. And that's why it's not kosher. Not because there's visually anything deficient. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't care about visual. He doesn't care about optics. He's concerned that it should be called a fruit, and it's not called a fruit if it's totally not ripe. So Tashma, look at the next brisa. Shir esro katan Rabbi Meir Omer goes Rabbi Yehuda Omer kebeitza. Another machlokus, which is what is the minimal size of an esrog? Rabbi Meir says the size of like a walnut, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, it could be the size of an egg is the minimal shear. So meaning that he's more machmir. So lav mishum de boy hadar, isn't it because he needs for it to be attractive, and if it's smaller than an egg, it's unattractive? Lo mishum de lo gomar peir. No. Again, it's got to do with the fact that if it's so small that it's just the size of a nut, it's a sign that it's not a ripened fruit. It's not a fruit yet, and therefore you can't use it. Tashmat. Let's look at the next brisa. Uvagadol kadei sheyecho shnaim biyado echas divrei Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi Omer afilu echad bishtei yadav. The another machlokus is Rabbi Yehuda says, what's the maximal shear of a large esrog? What shear must it not exceed? So Rabbi Yehuda says you have to be able to hold 2 esrogs in one hand. If it's any larger than that, it's not kosher. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and he says that even if you could hold that 1 esrog in 2 hands, it could be a humongous esrog and it's still kosher as long as you could hold it in 2 hands. Rabbi Yossi must have been a Yemenite, right? Because that's the way they hold their esrogim, right? So the Gemara says, my time, lav mishum deboy hadar. It isn't Rabbi Yehuda's reason because he says if an esrog is a monstrosity, it's not attractive anymore. So you see, once again, he requires it to be hadar. So the Gemara says, lo, kevin da amar rabba lulav biyamin ve'esrog bismol zimnan demachalfile va'asi la'afuchihu va'asi la'ivsule. So the Gemara says, no, it's a very, very practical logistic concern. If an esrog is so large that you can't fit 2 in one hand, so imagine one of those 2 esrogim in one hand is missing, and you substitute it with the lulav and the hadassim and the aravas, right? So you can hold the 2 in one hand. But let's say the esrog is so big you can't hold the esrog and the lulav in one hand. So then you have a problem, because let's say accidentally you pick up the esrog with your right hand and the lulav in your left hand. You got to switch hands. You're going to have to hold them. You're going to have to, while you're switching them, you're going to have to hold both in one hand temporarily. And if the esrog is so big that it's not going to fit, we're worried you're going to drop the esrog, and the esrog will develop some kind of defect when it falls to the floor, and you're going to passel your esrog. So Rabbi Yehuda says, don't use a large esrog because you're playing with fire. That's the reason why. It's got nothing to do with the attractiveness of the esrog. So therefore we see that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require hadar. So now the Gemara's question is, Ve'elo Rabbi Yehuda haksiv hadar. What is he going to do with the pasuk? It says pre-eitz hadar. So the Gemara says, Hahu hadar bi'ilano mishana l'shana. So he says he doesn't read the word as hadar, which means beautiful or attractive, but rather he reads it as hadar, that which resides. That which resides means that it's a fruit that is residential on its tree constantly throughout all the seasons. It's a perennial. Is that the right word? I'm not sure. Yeah. But it stays on the tree throughout the year, so that it's not seasonal, but rather it's continuous. Even in the winter, you can find esrogim growing. That's what the Torah means when it says pre-eitz hadar. Not beautiful, but perennial. Okay, let us go weiter. Shalashera v'shal iranidachas, the Mishnah had said is puzzle. An ashera tree is a tree that's used for idolatry. If you pull an esrog off of that tree, it's puzzle. And also from a city, if you take an esrog from a city which the Torah says has to be destroyed because the majority of the city was idolatrous, then that also has to be destroyed, and therefore you can't use it as an esrog. V'shal ashera puzzle. So since when should an esrog from an ashera tree be puzzle? V'ha'amar Rava lulav shel avodah zara lo yitol v'imnatal kasher. Rava had paskined that if you take an esrog from an avodah zarah tree, then halachically you're not supposed to use it for the mitzvah, but because it's disgusting to use something from avodah zarah for a mitzvah. But b'di'evet, if you did use it, it's still kosher. And you know why? Because avodah zarah is asur bahana. We all agree to that. You're not allowed to get any benefit from something that was for avodah zarah. But we have a principle of mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu, that the mitzvahs that I do are not for my personal benefit. So it's not called getting personal benefit when I perform a mitzvah with an object. So therefore, even though it's not right to use avodah zarah materials for a mitzvah, but b'di'evet, if you did, you're yotzei the mitzvah. It is legit. So how can Rava say that if the Mishnah says that an ashera tree is pasul? So the Gemara answers, Hacha ba'ashera demosha askinon dechetuse michtas shi'urei. The answer is that there are 2 types of ashera trees. The standard ashera tree is only on avodah zarah, and there, if you used it, you're yotzei the mitzvah. But our Mishnah is talking about a special case of ashera, which is what? Which is the ashera tree that was commanded to Moshe to destroy when you come into the land of Israel, and you encounter the ashera tree, you have an obligation to destroy all trees that are used for idolatry in the land of Israel. And what's the reason for that? The reason for that is because it's a special commandment to eradicate idolatry from the land of Israel. There, because the Torah commands you to destroy those trees, not just to not get benefit, but to destroy them, it's as if they are currently in their state of destruction, and therefore it's as if they're non-existent. If they're non-existent, they don't fulfill the minimum measurements of what you need for an estrog, and therefore you can't fulfill the mitzvah with them.
That Tzvi was only on the entrance to Eretz Yisrael?
Only on entrance to Eretz Yisrael.
Not afterwards.
Well, it could be that all trees of Eretz Yisrael that are for Avodah Zarah you have to eradicate, but I don't know that it applies today. In other words, it's only upon when you conquer the land you have to remove the avodah zarah that's there. That's a good shaila. I don't know what the halach is, whether there's an obligation bisman hazeh to eradicate avodah zarah. Yeah. Anyway, dikanami dikatani dumya di'iranidacha shmamina. We can infer this also from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah compares the Asherah tree to the Iranidachas. Just like an Iranidachas is a city which has to be destroyed, so to the Asherah tree is a tree that has to be destroyed. That's not true about regular avodah zarah. If the avodah zarah belongs to a non-Jew, you don't have a mitzvah to destroy it. You just can't benefit from it. So therefore, it's clear that our Mishnah is talking about the special case of Asherah tree that the Jews encountered when they came into Israel. Let's go on. Niktam Rosha. If the tip of the lulav is clipped, it's puzzle. That's what the Mishnah had said. Amar Rav Huna, lo shanu ela niktam, aval nistak kasher. That's only true if it's clipped at the top. But if it's merely cracked, if the leaves are cracked, it's still kosher. So the Gemara, v'nistak kosher, is that really so? The Hatanya, lulav kafuf, that if you have a bent over lulav, where the head is bent over, kavatz, or if there are thistles that are growing out of the spine, which means it's like a very ugly kind of branch, saduk, or if it's cracked, akum doime lemagal, or if it's curved in the shape of a sickle, so then puzzle. So those kinds of lulavim are all puzzle. Charus puzzle, doime lecharus kosher. If it's charus, which means it's totally dried out because it's grown on the tree for a long time and in the spine has become like wood, hard like wood, so then that's also puzzle. But if it's only on its way to becoming into that completely desiccated state, so then it's still kosher. Amar Rav Papa. So the worst is, you see clearly from this brisa that if it's cracked, it's puzzle. How can you tell me if it's cracked, it's kosher? So Amar Rav Papa da Avid Kehimnik. So Rav Papa says that brisa is not talking about where the leaves are merely cracked. It's talking about where the leaves at the tip of the lulav are growing out like two separate lulavim. In other words, the natural curvature of its growth is that you see a lulav that looks like it has two heads instead of coming to a point at the top. That's what the brisa says is kosher. But if you have a normative lulav which comes to a one point and some of the leaves are cracked, it's still kosher. Let's go weiter. Amar akum doime lemagal. So if it's curved and it looks like a sickle, so on that, Amar Rava lo amran ela lefanav avola acharav b'riyasehu. That's only puzzle if it's curved like a sickle and it's curved over away from the spine. So in other words, the spine is on this side, right, and it's curved over like this. That's where we say that it's puzzle. But if it's curved this way towards the spine, so that's natural. That's a natural growth of many times you do have a lulav that's curved this way, and therefore it's going to be kosher. Amar Rav Nachman, l'tzdadin kilafan of dami v'amri la kila achar of dami. Rav Nachman says if it's curved to the side, neither to the front or to the back, so some say that that's puzzle, because that's like being curved unnaturally away from the spine, and therefore it's puzzle. And some say that it's a natural curve, like it's as if it's curved towards the spine, and therefore it's kosher. Ba'amar Rava, hai lulva desalik b'chadhutza ba'almumhu puzzle. Finally, Rava says that if you have a lulav that it's perfectly fresh and green and everything is fine, however, all the leaves are on one side, and on the other side, for whatever reason, the way it grew is such that it's bare of leaves on one side and it's got only its leaves on one side, that's considered to be a balmum. That's considered to be a defective lulav, and therefore it's puzzle. You all have a wonderful day.